In 1610, a man on the run painted his own death and sent the canvas as a gift to the only person who had the power to pardon him. The painting is David with the Head of Goliath by Caravaggio. In the composition, a young man holds a severed head by the hair, his arms stretched far away from his body, as if trying to maintain distance from what he's just done. Blood still drips from the severed neck. The sword rests in his other hand, but there's no pride in the gesture. There is no triumphant pose, the kind any other painter of the era would have chosen to celebrate a biblical hero defeating a giant. David's face carries something closer to pity, or perhaps disgust, or both, mixed in a way that no single word can capture. And here is the detail that transforms this painting into something else entirely. The severed head of Goliath bears the face of Caravaggio himself. He painted himself as a dead monster, the defeated, the thing that needed to be eliminated. Art historians widely agree that the youthful face of David is also a younger version of the painter. In other words, the painting doesn't show a hero killing a villain. It shows a man being killed by his own youth, by what he used to be before he became what he turned into. Carl Jung spent his entire life studying this exact mechanism, not with a paintbrush, but with patience, dreams, and symbols. Centuries after Caravaggio painted his own decapitation, Jung experienced the psychological version of the very same scene, a total collapse of identity that he called the confrontation with the unconscious. What he discovered inside that dark place is the final piece of this video. But before we get there, you need to understand exactly who the Goliath is that you carry inside yourself, because it's his head that needs to fall first. There is a belief that most people treat as a virtue, but which is, in reality, Goliath's armor. The idea that a firm, immovable, unshakable identity is a sign of personal strength. You build a version of yourself, shield that version against any form of questioning, and call it a solid personality. When in truth, it might just be an ego that stopped growing years ago and learned how to disguise itself as maturity. Goliath, in the story, wasn't fragile. He was massive, armored, and armed to the teeth. And it was precisely that magnitude that made him blind. He never imagined he could be brought down by a single stone and a simple truth. The human ego works the exact same way. The more it inflates itself with titles, social approval, and the absolute need to always be right, the more it becomes a perfect target for the only thing capable of destroying it: a small, undeniable fact about yourself. The kind of truth your persona spent a lifetime teaching you to avoid. Jung used the word persona to describe the social mask you construct to function in the world. The presentable, edited, acceptable version of you. The problem was never having a persona. The problem arises when it hardens to the point where you forget that anything exists underneath it. When that happens, you're no longer protecting who you are. You are protecting Goliath. The very strength you are most proud of having might, in practice, be the exact dimension of your prison. Think of someone who spent years building a reputation as someone who never makes a mistake, at work, in their family, among friends. At the slightest critique, this person reacts with a disproportionate, almost automatic defense mechanism, as if admitting a flaw were equivalent to complete collapse. Nobody questions this armor because from the outside, it looks like competence, confidence, and control. Only the person living inside it knows the true price. Every act of rigidity is also an act of fear, disguised so well that even the person executing it has forgotten there is anything beyond it. Jung devoted a large part of his life to a concept he called individuation, the process by which the psyche moves toward a more authentic wholeness, integrating parts of itself that were previously left out for being too inconvenient, ugly, or dangerous for the ego to admit. And here is the reality check that no one prepares you to hear. This wholeness isn't built alongside your current identity. It is born on top of its ruins. The psyche, according to Jung, does not seek comfort. It seeks growth, even if that means demolishing the very structure that had, until then, guaranteed your stability. It's a mechanism that is almost cruel in its logic. For the self, the truest, most complete center of your psyche, to emerge, the ego must first lose the position of absolute command it held its entire life. It isn't senseless destruction. It is a sacrifice with a purpose. The same logic carved centuries ago into the blade of that sword. Yet most people interpret periods of identity crisis as an error that needs to be fixed immediately. Another course, another routine, another quick attempt to rush back to normal. Jung saw the exact opposite. He viewed these identity crises as the very mechanism of individuation in action, the definitive signal that something deep inside you has quietly decided it no longer fits inside its old skin. Feeling like you've lost your identity isn't a sign of failure. It's the sign that your actual life has finally begun to move. There's a critical distinction Jung insisted on making, one that changes everything. Dissolution is not annihilation. The psyche isn't trying to erase you. It's trying to reorganize you around a center far wider than the ego ever managed to occupy alone. That's why the process hurts as much as it liberates. From inside the ego, it feels like death. And it is, in fact, the only kind of death the ego is capable of experiencing. But it isn't the end of the story. It's only the first half. Now look closely at where Goliath lives every single day, disguised as your routine. He lives in the way you present yourself through your job title, acting as if your value as a human being were identical to the print on your ID badge, and in the silent panic you feel just imagining who you'd be without that title. He lives in your constant need for approval, in that almost physical addiction to praise and external validation, acting as a temporary painkiller for an insecurity that is never truly addressed. He lives in the petty emotional vices you label as your coping mechanisms, the drinking, the overeating, the mindless scrolling, any distraction, really, whenever life demands silence and reflection instead of stimulation. And above all, he lives in your systematic refusal to look into your own shadow, that collection of traits, impulses, and memories you decided long ago were safer swept under the rug than faced head-on. Every time you blame someone else for a flaw you secretly recognize in yourself, every time you react with disproportionate rage to a minor piece of criticism, that is Goliath reacting, armored, firing back before thinking, because the hard stone of truth just got a little too close to the armor. The great paradox is that you aren't trapped in these patterns out of weakness, but out of an excess of discipline. You dedicate so much daily energy to sustaining this Goliath that if you applied that same effort to literally any other pursuit, your success would be enviable. There is an accounting ledger almost no one learns to calculate. How much energy is spent every single day just keeping this Goliath upright? Jung called this energy libido, not in the strictly sexual sense Freud gave it, but as the general psychic energy that fuels the entire self. The exact same energy that could be feeding a creative project, a deeper relationship, or work that actually carries meaning. Every hour dedicated to shielding an old version of yourself against a small truth is an hour stolen from that reserve. And the deficit only reveals itself years later, when you realize you have zero energy left for anything other than your own defense. It's like keeping a soldier on guard in an empty fortress, night after night, protecting a treasure that isn't even there anymore. Breaking this cycle demands a stance most people reject the second they realize what it actually costs. You have to stop negotiating with Goliath and start walking through the very desert his downfall leaves behind. Jung frequently described a state that precedes almost every genuine transformation, a period of internal chaos, of lost coordinates, almost a functional depression, where the ego temporarily loses control over the narrative that held your life together up to that point. This isn't a poetic metaphor. It is a concrete, deeply uncomfortable state that many prefer to numb with medication, treating the symptom without ever asking what the psyche is trying to communicate through that collapse. It is this exact state etched into the face of David. Look at him again. It's not a posture of victory. It is a solemn, almost mourning expression. The face of someone who understands he just lost a piece of himself alongside the monster he killed. There is no clean version of this crossing. You don't walk through the desert looking at beautiful pictures of the oasis on the other side. You walk through it feeling the sand, the thirst, and the real, terrifying doubt of whether anything exists after it at all. Entering this state on purpose, instead of running away from it with the first available distraction, is what separates someone who merely suffers through a crisis from someone who actually undergoes a transformation. And this is where the world around you enters the frame. Because no one warns you about this. The people closest to you built part of their own stability on top of the very Goliath you're trying to tear down. Your family got used to the version of you that never pushes back. Your workplace got used to the person who always delivers more than they should, without ever asking for anything in return. Your friends got used to the listener who supports everyone else, but never demands space for their own pain. The moment you begin walking through your own dark night, the most common reaction from those around you won't be support. It will be alienation, disguised as concern. Many will tell you, "You've changed." Not as a neutral observation, but as a subtle demand for you to return to being the comfortable, predictable Goliath they all knew. This means recognizing that part of the resistance you will feel doesn't come from within. It comes from the outside, wrapped in good intentions but carrying the exact same weight as a chain tied around your ankle. It almost always plays out like this. After years of compliance, someone finally starts saying no where they used to say yes. They decline an unfair request. They set a boundary in a relationship. They stop making themselves automatically available for everything. And the first comment they receive from the people who should be celebrating this breakthrough isn't support. It's a polite form of guilt. "You've been different lately," spoken in a tone that begs, without saying it outright, for the old version of you to come back. Nobody puts the real reason into words. It is simply easier to live with a predictable Goliath than to learn how to deal with someone who was just reborn. However, by far the most dangerous obstacle doesn't come from the outside. It comes from within, disguised as the very thing that seems to be the solution, a cosmetic version of growth that never touches the shadow. You can change your routine, pick up a new habit, read another book on self-help, feel that momentary relief of working on yourself. And underneath it all, continue protecting the exact same wounds as before. That isn't transformation. That is just your persona changing its wardrobe while the underlying structure remains untouched. It's Goliath adopting a softer, more spiritualized vocabulary, yet still sitting on the very same throne, still refusing the only move that actually matters, looking directly at what you have hidden from yourself. Self-knowledge that never hurts isn't self-knowledge. It's just another sophisticated way of fleeing your own shadow while pretending to practice virtue. You could read every single book Jung ever wrote and still never do the actual work they describe. Collecting concepts about the shadow is not the same as facing it. It is entirely possible, and shockingly common, to use the precise vocabulary of individuation as the latest layer of your persona. An intellectualized version of Goliath, now capable of quoting archetypes while continuing to avoid the only mirror that truly counts, the one within. We finally arrive at what remains on the other side when Goliath finally falls. Jung called this destination the self, not the ego that commands, but the total center of the psyche, the point where the conscious and the unconscious cease fighting each other and begin to integrate. And here is what almost no one tells you. The self isn't a perfect version of you. It is a complete version of you. An individuated person isn't someone without flaws. They are simply someone who stopped pretending those flaws don't exist. Someone who integrated their shadow instead of projecting it onto others. Someone who finally stripped off the persona when it ceased serving them and began imprisoning them. In 1913, Jung himself lived the most extreme version of this. He broke ties with Sigmund Freud, which was not merely a theoretical disagreement, but the end of a relationship that had been the anchor of his professional life for years. In the months that followed, Jung entered a state so profound that he himself feared it was the onset of psychosis. He lost his footing entirely. He experienced visions he couldn't explain, and voices rising from the deepest depths of his own mind without warning. And instead of fleeing from that chaos through overwork or denial, he did the exact opposite of what standard advice would recommend. He stepped into it on purpose. He began documenting every image that emerged from that collapse into notebooks that would later become the Red Book. He called this process the confrontation with the unconscious. It lasted for years, and it was precisely from that place, from that deliberate decay of his own identity, that the concepts of the self, the shadow, archetypes, and individuation were born. The very backbone of everything you're hearing right now. Jung didn't survive that period by escaping it. He survived by walking through it systematically, without rushing to close the wound before its time. And it is his methodology, not vague inspiration, that you take with you today. First, pay attention to your dreams. Jung treated them as letters from the unconscious addressed directly to you, signaling with precision what needs to change long before your conscious mind notices. You don't need to decipher symbols like an oracle. Simply write down what repeats and ask yourself with total honesty, what is this refusing to let me forget? Second, do the shadow work. Choose, without sparing yourself, the single trait you condemn most in others. The arrogance that irritates you in a coworker, the cowardice that infuriates you in a friend. Ask yourself where that exact same trait lives inside of you, disguised as something else. Third, accept the suffering of the crossing instead of numbing it. Do not look for shortcuts through the pain of transformation. Walk through it consciously, knowing it has an expiration date, and that the date only gets pushed back when you insist on running away. Genuine change comes at a high price. You will lose your footing. You will feel exposed. You will doubt yourself for a time. There are no shortcuts on this crossing. Anyone promising growth without discomfort is selling you a new mask, not your true essence. Look once more at that image. A young man reaches out his arm, holding the representation of his own past, his former self. He isn't celebrating. He's simply accepting it. This transition is the cost of our psychological evolution. Detachment hurts, not because suffering is the goal, but because no truer version of you can be born unless your old self is left behind. You cannot become who you truly are if you insist on clinging to who you used to be. David had the courage to sever his own pride to find his essence. And you? What do you need to let go of today so that your most authentic self can finally be born? Write it in the comments without editing. My old self is dead. You don't need a polished answer, just the courage to write it. If this video touched something real, hit the like button. It will unlock a hype button right below. Press that one too. It's a small gesture, but it acts as a form of resistance, helping this kind of content reach someone else who is currently carrying a Goliath that should have fallen long ago. If you want to go beyond a symbolic gesture, consider becoming a channel member, not as passive consumption, but as a public commitment to this philosophy of facing your shadow instead of running from it. I've left the next video at the end screen. It picks up exactly where this one ends. Remember, no self is born unless a Goliath falls first. The only question that remains is whether you will take the stone into your own hands, or continue waiting for life to decide for you in the slowest, most brutal way possible.